things that aren't ideal. We've talked about this with the good doctor, Dr. John Braccio, before. In marriages, when they say a good marriage is made in heaven, well, maybe, but it's also made here on terra firma. It takes a lot of work, and if you have a good one, when there's bumps in the road, you try to keep things together. What about when those bumps are just about insurmountable? And we've had in the last few weeks some pretty good reasons for why something would be basically unsalvageable unless you really want to give it a good go, and many do. But what about when a marriage, it just seems like there's nothing that's going right anymore? It doesn't even have to be something like infidelity. There can be a lot of different things going on, have nothing to do with that. Well, let's get the word from him today. Regional Psychological Services in East Lansing. drjohnb.com, the place for the podcast. Good morning, sir.
Well, good morning to you, Dave. And I think we can say that when a person gets married, it's generally one of the happiest, most memorable days of their life. Unfortunately, a number of these relationships really sour over the years. They don't always end in divorce, but they can end in really being unhappy living together. And this can happen for a lot of reasons, and not the extreme reasons of the extramarital affairs, physical abuse, child abuse, things of that type. No, they're just kind of the things that seep in over a period of years as people are together, ranging from apathy to really even hatred. But in the middle of those, it can be a lack of respect, a lack of appreciation, lack of intimacy. Can be always annoyed at the other person, constant arguing, bickering, fault-finding. And turns out the relationship can be toxic to the emotional well-being of the person. There can be intimidation. There can be fear. People can stay together over religious beliefs opposed to divorce, that marriage is seen as a sacred bond vowed before God. Differing religious views, future goals have changed, and they're just not compatible at the present. Fear of what could happen after a divorce, a person's fearful of leaving. Financial concerns after a divorce, if this were to occur. The impact of a divorce on children, child custody concerns, overall family relations. And when you put all these together, then you're not connected. And also there can be substance abuse, there can be how to manage your money. Then you can have feelings of guilt and shame if the marriage fails. So I've given a list, a number of reasons here, but these are all real. These are reasons when they weigh on the person, they can take a tremendous toll. And people even they get used to each other. They just live together, but there's no real fire. There's no energy. There's no love. And when this happens, it's very, very difficult for the person who's unhappy. They can be both within the marriage. But these marriages sometimes go on permanently. They never really end, and they never change. They never really get better. So it's really a very unfortunate, often very unhappy life for the spouses. Of course, this can spill over into the raising of the children.
And you've seen this before. I know you have, and I've known people like this that have been married, like one couple, for more than 50 years, and you're like with their family, this is exciting. You're going to have a party. It's going to be at the, at the whatever hall, and and they're kind of like about it, and you just get the impression they're not happy, and you get that phrase, they're a real grumpy old happy married couple. But sometimes that's true. I mean, you don't want it to be, but sometimes it's just a matter of, after all so many years, a matter of habit, isn't it, Doc?
Well, it really is, and people just get used to each other, and this isn't always good, the way they get used to each other. It's the bickering, arguing couple that we see all the time. You can be in a grocery store, you can be having coffee, it can be your own relatives, it can be friends, and they're really pretty cutting and fault-finding, and you just say to yourself, my oh my. Sometimes people will say, well, that's just the way they are, and they've got used to it, but if you really get to know them, they don't like that. It just is... It's a touche, it just happens in the relationship. Probably more common is the fear of being alone, the fear of financial loss, of not knowing how to get by, the fear it could be child custody. Some of these are big issues, and they're not easy to just say, oh, well, and this can keep people together in situations that really unhappy, and one or both are not willing to work on. And when that happens, you can imagine the catastrophe of what's going on. And then you have another thing, too. Sometimes the blow-up of telling the truth, and I mean about anything, like you forgot to get the milk, rather than just say you forgot to get the milk, you end up arguing about you didn't tell me to get the milk. So anything can lead to a fight and an argument. The person
things
feels
that
if they doing
seem utterly trivial that can spark into things that are beyond trivial. I mean, it can make for a major problem just because it's happening all the time, and yet the things you would consider not to be important, and suddenly to that couple, maybe that bickering and that arguing point is very important. It doesn't make any sense anybody else looking out from the outside in.
Well, and that's true, and it leads to the point that people just really can even get to hate each other. They just fight, and the fault finders, if you will, that type thing. Or one person will say, you forgot to close the garage. Say, oh, aren't you perfect? You forgot to open the window. I mean, then you start, when you unravel the argument that they had, you find out it related to something completely very trivial at the beginning, but then each got their bag of, angry points and started throwing them as bombs at the other one. And before you know it, it's a totally destructive relationship. Some people really are incapable of really communicating. They live together. They may even have signs of peace and retreat on given days, okay, but as a whole, there's just unhappiness. And I hate to see it. And when I work with a couple, I try to give them ideas in terms of how to get along better,
right.
How to sort things out. But it's much harder than you might think. When you get that combination of love, of sexuality, of children, of financial commitment, you put that whole circle, then bring God into the whole thing. You put that whole circle together, and when there's problems, it can be very, very difficult to sort out. And both persons have to be very willing to do that and willing to work on it. And fortunately, that does happen sometimes. People are able to overcome these, but it only happens if people are really, really, committed.
Doc, did you ever try to take them back to what got them together and connected in the first place, if indeed it was a series of things that, were positive and that they can relate, and even though maybe they haven't happened a lot in recent years, you can somehow reconnect and fire that spark again? Is that ever part of it, or
yes,
is that easier said than done?
Well, it's easier said than done, but that's obviously a starting point. Even if I'm just talking to somebody I know, but certainly if I'm doing therapy with a couple, I always try to say, well, why did you two fall in love? Why did you two get together? What were those golden days like? And it's funny because often they can talk about that with always the caveat, well, it's certainly not that way now. Okay, and just say, well, let's not deal with now. Let's look at what was and how this happened and how you can get to the point you can work on it. I have a view there are 3 stages of marriage. I think we talked about this before. First, there's the ecstatic, happy together.
Sure.
Then the second stage is where you work things out and you sort out that Mary or Chucky is not perfect. Okay, then you work things out and you have a successful, happy marriage. If you don't do that, then it goes into stage 3 where things really fall apart. And if things get really ugly and really bad in that stage, then it's often too late to go back to stage 2 or 1. 2 where you're solving issues, and then 1 where things are really, really good.
And Doc, those stages they don't have to be like a set number of months or years. I mean, for some people they can come very quickly, can't they? It just for others it takes a while. It just that's always variable, but in the varying time frame you see those stages and they kind of they present themselves, don't they?
Well, they really do. Living a lifetime with somebody, as you and I know, it does require you sort things out, you change, you try to grow together, you try to have common friends. That doesn't mean you can't have some individual friends and groups.
Yeah.
But as a whole, you're building a life together. And then when you add children, that adds a lot of stress too, particularly when you get 2 parents that completely see parenting, in a different way. So overall, marriage really is a wonderful institution, but it's also a horrible one if people don't get along. And then when I mentioned right off the bat, the lack of respect, lack of appreciation, lack of intimacy, you get those 3 together, and then it's hard to bring them back, because if you've been behaving in a certain way, doing certain things that really aren't fair, that you're kind of overdoing in the house, when you try to set things into a 50-50, the other person gets angry. Well, you've always done that. Well, that's not a good reason. Then you have to be willing to sit down, talk about setting things up, because that can lead to resentment, and resentment can lead to anger, and anger. You know the routine.
The statements that are absolutes, they don't give you anywhere. There's nowhere to retreat to. There's nowhere to say, here's common ground. It's all or nothing. Like you like to say, it's Caesar or nothing. Yeah. But in a marriage, you don't always. If you think it's Caesar or nothing, you're going to have a problem in a marriage.
That is true, and of course the meaning Caesar, of course, was Caesar. So if you want to play Caesar, you better not do it in a marriage.
No, it's not going to work. It's not going to work with a marriage. And I know that we don't want people, when they grab this podcast, don't edit. When the doc said marriage is a wonderful institution, but it's also a horrible one, remember, he followed up with more after that to qualify that.
Yes.
Don't grab that snippet, because what's important here is that there's tricky marriages. Maybe have gone on a long time, but reconnecting and finding what made people get together in the first place, that can be a great way of saving and then fostering and nurturing and going forward. The Good Doc you can find with the podcast at drjohnb.com, Regional Psychological Services of East Lansing.
Could I throw in one other thought?
You may.
Whenever you're talking with your spouse, this is good for any relationship, use I statements. I feel this way, rather than saying you made me feel this way, because those are fighting words. Try to say how this reacts to you in your interaction with a person. That may be a little step beyond what we're talking today, but it's a good way to start. I'm glad you qualified about my statement.
I circled that one. It said never snippet that one out there, because there's a ... and everything after the dot is hugely important. Always good to talk to you, my friend, as we get started here on a short week and summer kicks off. Be well.
Have a great day, my friend. Bye-bye.
Dr. John Braccio. We're back in a moment. 1320 WILS.